Good afternoon. My name is Mike Prerau, and I'm very happy to welcome you to today, our third webinar in the series. Today's webinar is going to be on the new NIH data sharing policy and how potentially the NSRR can help with that and the requirements thereof. Today, we'll have three different talks, two by people from the NIH and one by our own NSRR team. And so I'd like to start out with our first talk by Dr. Chanel Press. Dr. Press is the co-chair for the implementation work group on NIH policy for data management and sharing, where she works to support the NHLBI mission as a liaison for various strategic programs. Dr. Press, thanks so much for coming today.
So, hi everyone. I'm happy to be here today to speak about the new NIH policy for data management and sharing. As the co-chair of the NHLBI Data Management and Sharing Policy Implementation Work Group. As you are all likely are aware, in October 2020, NIH published its final NIH policy for data management and sharing and supplemental information on the Federal Register. And the purpose for the new policy is to foster good data stewardship and promote a culture shift to make the practice of data management and responsible data sharing the norm. And the policy is set to become effective on January 25th, 2023. And essentially, the policy requires that all NIH-funded research submit a data management and sharing plan and explaining how, where, and when data will be shared. And once the plan is approved by the funding NIH ICO, the grantees will be required to comply with the plan. NIH has also published several supplemental information to help provide guidance on how to comply with the policy. So the policy, the devil is in the details, and the policy applies to all research funded and conducted in whole or in part by NIH that results in the generation of scientific data. And the policy also provided a definition for what is scientific data, as quoted here. So the recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community as of sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings, regardless of whether the data are used to support scholarly publications. And something like the laboratory notebooks, preliminary analyses, or completed case report forms, or drafts of scientific papers, peer reviews, etc., are not considered scientific data by this policy. And the policy generally expects data to be shared as soon as possible and has set an outer bound for when the scientific data needs to be shared. And that is no later than publication or end of award for unpublished data. And while the policy does not have any explicit requirement as to how the data should be shared, investigators should consider relevant requirements and expectations, such as repository policies, retention requirements, or journal policies for minimum timeframes for sharing data. So the policy has an expectation that researchers will maximize appropriate data sharing, but recognizes that there are justifiable ethical, legal, and technical factors that may limit or preclude sharing. So on the NIH Central Data Sharing website, which I'll talk about more later, it provided some examples of appropriate limiting factors, including restrictions set by the informed consent signed by the research participants, or if the privacy or safety protections of the participants cannot be adequately assured using available measures, or explicit federal, state, local or tribal law, regulation, or policy, or any existing or anticipated agreements with other parties, such as the data use agreements or licensing agreements, may also pose some restrictions on data sharing. And for example, the NIH SBIR and STTR program policy directive permits withholding data for 20 years. And as stipulated in agreements and consistent with program goals. And if researchers do not want to share data because they consider the data are too small to make a difference or will not be widely used, this will not likely be approved as justifiable reason for not sharing data. And not having a repository in mind is also not an acceptable reason. So as mentioned earlier, NIH has published several supplemental guidance on the policy to assist relevant stakeholders in implementing and complying with the DMS policy. NIH OD is continuously publishing FAQs and helpful resources on the central NIH data sharing website, which the public can access. And the supplemental guidance on elements of a data management and sharing plan outlines the elements NIH would like to see in a DMS plan, although it's not strictly required out of the policy. But these recommended elements include data type, which is for identifying data to be preserved and shared, and related tools and software code used or needed to access and manipulate data, or data standards to be applied to scientific data and metadata, or data preservation, access, and timelines, such as repository to be used, persistent unique identifier, and when and how long data will be available, and also element of access, distribution, and reuse considerations, which you would describe if there are factors that would limit sharing. And finally, oversight of data management, which is to indicate plan compliance will be monitored and managed, and by whom in the institution and at NIH. And researchers are encouraged to visit writing a data management and sharing plan from the central data sharing website at NIH for more details, which I'll also provide in later slides. So it is generally recommended that the DMS plan do not exceed 2 pages long. And NIH OD has also developed a suggested DMS plan format, which will become a fillable version in the Forms H application instructions by fall 2022. I believe that in between my preparing the slides and today, it may have already become available as a fillable format. And the format generally aligns with the same elements we have just talked through. You can have a preview of this format page on the Central Data Sharing website. The DMS policy strongly encourages NIH-supported researchers to share their data via an established repository. Either can be a discipline-specific or generalist repository of the investigator's choosing. There's not a specific repository or list NIH wants to prescribe, as different repositories may better serve the needs of researchers in different scientific fields and communities. But NIH ICOs may go beyond the policy and designate or set up expectations for specific repositories, such as BDC or NSRR from NHOBI. In general, repositories for sharing NIH data should conform with the FAIR principles, which is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So the supplemental guidance on repository selection does outline a list of 12 desirable characteristics that researchers should look for when choosing a repository, including the use of unique persistent identifiers, metadata, curation, and quality assurance, and data security and ease of access. And you can reasonably expect that the repository will exist for foreseeable future for reliable data sharing. Again, I encourage you to read the supplemental guidance for more details. If you work with or plan to work with human participants in your research, you may also want to pay attention to the supplemental information on protecting privacy when sharing human research participant data, which outlines the best practices for managing and sharing human data in line with the common rule and the HIPAA privacy rule. Researchers are expected to de-identify individual participants' data to the greatest extent possible while maintaining integrity and scientific utility of the data, and consider any additional risks, even the data is de-identified. And identified data should only be shared with explicit consent from the research participants. It is recommended that a data use agreement should be developed and signed by all parties when data is being transferred from one entity to another. And the agreement should outline the prohibitions on attempt to re-identify or contact the participants and limitations on the data use, if any. And researchers should also be aware if there are any legal protections and limitations on disclosure, such as certificate of confidentiality. NIH recognizes that making data accessible and reusable by other researchers may incur costs, and data sharing shouldn't be an unfunded mandate. So researchers are allowed to put in the budget request for funding to support the data management and sharing activities described in their approved plan. And the supplemental info on allowable costs has outlined what kind of things that investigators can put in the budget request. For example, reasonable costs may include curating data, or developing supporting documentation, or depositing data into repositories, and activities necessary to manage and preserve data prior to depositing data into a repository. And researchers are not allowed to put in something along the line of infrastructure costs not associated with a particular project, which is typically included in indirect costs or costs associated with the routine conduct of research, such as gaining access to research data. It is important that these things are not double charged as both direct and indirect costs. It is important to know that any costs need to be incurred during the performance period, even if you plan to make your data available for sharing for the next 10 or 20 years. So you really want to prospectively plan for the data sharing and budget in advance for the costs for sharing your data for that duration. And you can visit the supplemental info for more guidance on how to budget for your DMS plan. NIH plans to monitor and assess the data sharing costs during the initial implementation period to inform the future guidance. I want to talk a little about how will the DMS plans be evaluated. So once you submit the plan along with your application, NIH program staff will assess and determine if the DMS plan is acceptable or not acceptable based on whether the elements outlined have been addressed in the plan and the appropriateness of those responses. And peer reviewers will not see the full DMS plans and will only weigh in on the reasonableness of the budget for data sharing. And it's required that the plan be approved prior to the award. And any issues with the plan need to be resolved before an award can be made. If there's any change or update to the plan during the performance period, investigators should communicate with the PO, and any changes would need to be approved. The approved DMS plan is essentially one of the terms and conditions of the award, to the institution, and NIH will be monitoring for compliance. As part of the compliance, grantees need to continually report the progress on the plan during the regular reporting intervals. And NIH staff will review the progress and overall compliance on annual basis before issuing a non-competing award. As any other non-compliance, failure to comply with the approved plan may result in an enforcement action, including additional special terms and conditions or termination of award. And this could be factored into any future funding decisions to the institution as well. And as you are aware, other than DMS policy, there are many data sharing policies and guidance across NIH. For example, the genomic data sharing policy, if your research generates genomic data, subject to the GDS policy. And the DMS policy really establishes the foundation or floor for data sharing. And many NIH ICOs may have separate data sharing policies, guidance, or expectations that add to or build upon the DMS policy. And satisfying one policy may not guarantee satisfying the other. So researchers may want to know what other policies also apply to your research. And to this end, NIH has developed an online decision tool to help researchers navigate all the different policy expectations through the central data sharing website. For example, if you're funded through NHLBI and you want to know if there's any NHLBI specific data sharing policy, which is very likely because that's what our working group is working on. So you can follow the steps using this online tool to do the search. And I encourage you to check this out and play with the tool a little bit. And ultimately, the applicants and awardees should consult with the program official at the funding ICO to determine what policies apply and how to comply. So right now, the website is still showing the old data sharing policy for clinical trials and epi studies from NHLBI. And we're working on updating this policy to be consistent or harmonized with the DMS policy. So stay tuned for an update from NHLBI. So on this topic, I also want to mention that, as I already mentioned, NHLBI does have an existing policy and we're updating, and it will be replaced by the new data sharing policy, which is developed by our IWG group, NHLBI implementation work group on NIH policy for data management and sharing, short for IWG. So our work group was established in October 2021 to devise a institute plan and guidance for implementing the NIH DMS policies through NHLBI portfolios and activities. We also anticipate to develop a communication, training, and dissemination plan for informing NHLBI and external stakeholders on their roles and responsibilities. I've had the pleasure to co-chair IWG and work with many of my colleagues and subject matter experts at NHLBI in programs, contracts, grants management, communication, and large data science programs such as the TopMed and BDC. We expect to publish our final deliverables in January 2023, hopefully in that timeline, including the revised NHLBI data sharing policy and to be harmonized with the DMS policy. And possibly this will be published via a guide notice. We'll also have FAQs and communication materials for the communities. And so stay tuned. We have only a little over 2 months before the new policy takes effect. And you may agree that it is not too early to start preparing for the policy compliance. You may want to start with familiarizing yourself with the DMS policy and the new NHLBI data sharing policy once it's available. as well as all the resources available at the sharing.nih.gov. If you are new to data sharing, and you can try to identify any existing resources and expertise within your institution and research community who may have been more attuned for helpful advices for data sharing. If you plan to submit something on and after the policy's effective date, you may want to start drafting a data management and sharing plan for your proposed research using the elements guidance. And as in keeping with the spirit of DMS policy, you can help promote this culture shift by having a reflection on your past data sharing practices and identify if there are other funder or publisher expectations, and consider what changes need to be implemented at your individual lab, your consortium or institution level to stay compliant and promote a data sharing norm. So the DMS policy and its supplemental info are all available in the published guide notices listed here. And I highly encourage all of you to visit the NIH Central Data Sharing website for more details of the information I presented today. And lastly, I want to flag that a new NHLBI data sharing policy and associated FAQs will be published sometime soon that will detail specific expectations from NHLBI. If you have any questions about the DMS policy, you can email sharing@nih.gov. For any specific questions about NHLBI policy and resources, which is yet to come out, but we already have a sharing box from NHLBI as well, and that is data sharing at nhlbi.nih.gov, which you can contact for any questions you have about the policy and implementation at NHLBI. So last, I want to thank you and happy to take any questions. I realize that I may be a little bit over time.
Okay, so here's our first question. Does the NIH communicate directly with institutions? While NIH has a broad drive for data sharing, there might be institutional bureaucracy that prevents this from happening smoothly. What should an investigator do?
Yeah, so that's definitely something that we're recognizing, and obviously it takes a community and takes a village to address this culture shift, right? Which is really what this DMS policy about, because once we had this, even though it's not a data sharing mandate, but by requiring that you submit a plan outlining your data management sharing, it kind of forces the investigators and also the institution to think ahead about how you want to share your data. And if there's any limitations or any prohibitions to sharing data, you have to justify that. So general bureaucracy is definitely not a justifiable reason for not sharing data. And I also want to speak to the aspect that I think part of the paperwork and bureaucracy you're saying like was taking a long time to share the data is because of the paperwork. Speaking from the experiences from GDS policy, that we do have institutional certification that we need to collect when investigators from institutions are submitting their data. And that I know that it usually takes a long time to even move through the individual institution for collecting signatures. And also it entails IRB review as well. So that's definitely something to keep in mind, because with DMS policy implementation, many data may be shared via a controlled access. And I know that at NHLBI, I won't speak for other ICs, but I'm also aware that other ICs have similar processes in place. That at NHLBI, we are also utilizing the institutional certification for accepting, like the BDC, for accepting controlled access data into BDC. And that's definitely has been a bottleneck, and it has always been taking time. So I think I don't know all the solutions for that, but I think one possible advice I could give is to start just as that you plan your data sharing and develop your data sharing plan early, also plan the institutional certification process early. If you know that you're going to have data from human research participants, and that's likely going to be shared via controlled access. So start that process early, and as the institutional certification can take months to collect.
Okay. One more question, and then we can have some more questions at the end. Can you please clarify which publication marks the time when data should be viewed? Is it just the primary paper or when all of the papers are out for that grant? And secondly, are the costs included under the overall current NIH budget cap?
Yes, I think that's addressed by an FAQ published by NIH OD. I think the budget is included in the budget cap. And to your first question, I think you're asking about like what publication marks the. Could you repeat that question again?
The question was, which publication marks the time when the data should be viewed, should be shared? Is it the primary paper or when all of these things are out? And I think that's sort of yeah.
Yeah, so whenever you have a paper out, publication out, and any data underlying that paper you use for that publication needs to be shared at the same no later than the publication as the policy specifies.
Great. We'll have some more questions at the end. Thank you so much, Dr. Press.
Sure, stay on.
Okay. Our next speaker is Dr. Alfonso Alfini, who's a program director at the National Center on Sleep Disorders Research in the division of NHLBI. He oversees sleep disorders medicine portfolio, which supports research on the genetic predisposition, risk factors, pathogenesis, epidemiology, diagnosis, and treatment of sleep and circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorders. And he'll be speaking on the importance of data sharing for sleep research in particular. Dr. Alfini, thanks so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Michael said, I am the program director for sleep disorders medicine in the National Center on Sleep Disorders Research at the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute at the NIH. So at the NIH, the goal for data sharing is to expedite the translation of research results into scientific advancements and effective interventions to improve human health. Sleep and circadian data that have been collected, are currently being collected, and will be collected in the future have the power and potential to transform biomedical research through integration across NIH research domains. Technological advancements are allowing sleep data to be collected more comfortably, affordably, and on a much larger scale than ever before. Leveraging sleep and circadian big data will lead to the discovery of pathways, subphenotypes, and treatment targets, and has implications beyond the sleep and circadian fields, and will lead to the recognition and subsequent integration of sleep and circadian biology across many other research domains. Big data will revolutionize the fields, but in order to do so, ensuring data sharing and accessibility must be a priority. Resources like the NSRR go well beyond a simple repository. These resources are a catalyst for the new era of data sharing. NSRR is not only building towards a sleep data commons, it also allows research communities to ask new and interesting questions. For those who are interested in knowing more about NIH interest in sleep and circadian research, the NIH-wide sleep research plan is readily available online. You can also attend the Sleep Disorders Research Advisory Board public meetings, and the next one is scheduled for Thursday, December 1st, starting at noon Eastern Time. And with that, I'll say thank you and pass it back to the hosts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alfini. If we have any questions for him, we can come back to those at the end. And so next, we'll turn to Professor Susan Redline, who many of you have heard from before in our other webinars, as well as Paige Sparks, who's the clinical research manager for the NSRR. And so they'll be talking about how can the NSRR itself help investigators with this new policy, and what are sort of the qualities of the research that we, the qualities of the repository that allow it to fit within this new plan. So Dr. Redline, Paige, please take it away.
Great, thank you, Mike. Are you able to see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, so we want to share a little bit today about how the NSRR is planning to help investigators meet these new data sharing requirements outlined in the new data sharing policy. Chanel gave a really wonderful overview of this, so thank you for her overview of the new policy. and to Alfonso for sharing how this policy will help accelerate sleep and related research. I do want to highlight that the NIH has created this wonderful data management and sharing policy hub. We found it very helpful in understanding various aspects of the new guidance, and looking at this hub as a central space to look for resources. There are many resources available, just a few of them are listed here. There are various formats for each of these resources as well. The notices themselves, a frequently asked questions page that is continually updated, multiple webinars which have now been recorded and are available. Additionally, your institution might have institution-specific resources available, and the NSRR is working to help researchers meet these requirements by serving as their data repository or as a potential data repository. In thinking about a data repository that would be the best fit for your data, we would like to highlight that the NSRR is listed in the National Library of Medicine's Open Domain Specific Data Sharing Repositories list. It has a number of repositories available, and the NSRR is the only sleep-specific repository on this list. Additionally, as Chanel mentioned, there is supplemental information available for selecting a repository for data resulting from NIH-supported research. This includes a list of desirable characteristics for data repositories, and the NSRR is planning a public-facing webpage which will detail how the NSRR meets each of the desirable characteristics set out in this supplemental information. Additionally, the NSRR aims to adhere to FAIR principles, that is, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. Similar to the desirable characteristics, we will have a public-facing page that details how the NSRR aligns with the FAIR guiding principles. From there, we also plan to provide NSRR-specific resources, which are used throughout our data ingestion process. This process was reviewed in our first webinar for the series, and a recording of that is available on our website. We will review these NSRR-specific resources and guidance in the coming slides. Some of the guidance that we're planning to put together includes an annotated DMP form. So this is the form that Chanel had referenced, the 2-pager customized for sleep-related data that promotes the best practices in sleep research. Additionally, as part of our data deposition, we ask for a share form to be completed by our depositors. We have a page that details our data sharing procedures in an overview format. We have a checklist that details what we will ask contributors to provide, as well as a detailed metadata intake form so that folks can start thinking about all of the metadata that accompanies that data that's been collected, as well as conventions that are published for signals related data. And as Chanel mentioned, it's important to think about cost and budget for this early. So we're happy to also provide a sample cost structure. This is a quick sneak peek of the data management and sharing template. Note that this is a sample. It's a preview of that draft. For each of the individual elements, we plan to annotate a sample response or details information that tracks to our data ingestion process, as well as best practices for data management of sleep data. So for example, in the first part, the element 1 data type, specifying the types of data, as well as the format and the amount of data expected. For how the scientific data will be preserved and shared, and the rationale for doing so. For example, the raw PSG sleep questionnaire and activity data will be shared, but perhaps there are clinical notes that are unable to be meaningfully identified. And so those will perhaps not be shared in raw form to protect participant privacy, but instead will be summarized. And additionally, details of the types of metadata that we anticipate related to the sleep data generated, and that will be shared through the data repository. So for PSG metadata, we would expect the collection system, sensor types, montage labels, sampling rates, and a manual of procedures that details those procedures. Additionally, for actigraphy metadata, it might include the device type, sampling rate, sleep and wake estimation algorithm, and the procedures. And study level metadata is documented in a README file. I'll pass this to Dr. Redline to go through the data management plan elements in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Paige. And again, thank you, Alfonso and Chanel. You did a really great job in I think, educating all of us on what we really need to prepare. And Paige has, I think, introduced this idea that here at the NSRR, with our NHLBI funding and our commitment to promote best practices of data management and really also the rigor, reproducibility of sleep data research and transparency, we see actually this NIH requirement as a great opportunity for all of us to really step up our game. And what we would like to do as part of NSRR is partner with the sleep research community and really help you not just meet the minimal requirements that NIH has for data management plans and sharing, but really do that in a way where you're also promoting best practices and interoperability of sleep data. So what I'm going to do in the next few slides is talk a little bit more specifically about how NSRR would like to partner with the sleep research community as you develop your data management plan, and then when you get funded, when you implement it. So Chanel's already talked about the key elements that NIH requires in terms of defining data access, distribution, reuse, data types, data standards, data preservation, tools, software, and oversight of data management. Next slide. So again, I'm just going to go into a few of these key objectives. So when we think about data preservation, access, and timelines, the key things that you as researchers have to think about is where you're going to deposit your data. And as Paige said, there are multiple repositories out there. There's obviously repositories for just genetics data, for some cardiovascular data. But the NSR is really customized to really ingest and annotate and add value to sleep data. So we of course encourage you to think of NSRR as a target repository. And that will allow you, if you would identify NSRR with, as Paige said, meeting the FAIR standards. And you as an investigator would identify your timeline, considering some of the issues Chanel brought up in terms of when you expect publications to come out, and then also considering what your own local costs are in terms of curation of data and other data management related costs. And what we will be proposing is really, again, doing work with you as partners to really help you create these plans in a sleep sensitive or best practice in sleep way. So we are developing sample text for you to use in your grants and your IRB submission. And we are, as Paige said, we're developing materials right on our web pages to talk about compliance with FAIR principles. We're starting to work on sample cost structures, and we are really prepared to consult with investigators on what the data management plan will look like. Paige, next. So the second area is data types and standards. And this is what excites me the most, because this gets into the nitty-gritty of the specialized sleep data that our community is so excited about. So you as an investigator need to describe what data are you collecting? Are you doing polysomnography? Are you doing a certain kind of survey? Are you doing biochemical data? And you, of course, will, as investigators, will define what standards that you will apply to your scientific data and associated metadata. And, you know, I'll refer you to prior webinars where we talked about sleep metadata and approaches for it, and some of the comments that Paige made about metadata, but they include describing how data are formatted, where the data come from, includes, you know, a structured, easy to use data dictionary, how data identifiers are applied, definitions and data documentation. But we know this is actually a big task, and there's great variability in how people develop their metadata. Some are very skimpy and some are very comprehensive. But we have at NSRR spent a lot of time thinking about sleep metadata. So we're really eager to talk to you about guidelines about developing those metadata and including, you know, an overview of the types of standards that you could discuss for your sleep data, and really discuss issues, for example, of what type of, for PSG data, you know, the type of EDF format information, how you may want to refer to various survey instruments using, for example, REDCap validated forms. And then again, for metadata, how you might refer to clinical data elements and ontologies. And in fact, we're working with the National Library of Medicine to deposit standardized sleep common data elements into the National Library of Medicine. Next. And this is just an example of how we can work with you on sleep-specific data and really create tables that here you see on the first column, polysomnography data, sleep questionnaires and actigraphy, and really beginning to map out, you know, with you, you know, some of the key things you want to know about it. How many samples are you going to collect? What type of data is it from a survey? Is it from a biometric or physiologic measurement? Is it done at an individual level or a larger unit of aggregation? How the data may be processed? Are they raw or unfiltered, or they've been derived or otherwise processed? The format, you know, for example, an EDF output or CSV output, whether there are any limitations to sharing, and again, sort of the metadata associated with that. So for example, for PSG, it could include the collection system, the sensor types, the montage labels, sampling rates, and the manual procedure. For actigraphy, you know, which is often poorly documented in research, it may include exactly how things were, you know, description of how things were annotated, what the algorithms were used, sampling rates, device types, model numbers, and so forth. Next page. Next. And all of these, and these could be provided in various forms in data dictionaries and manuals and so forth. The next area that I think can be very sleep specific are, you know, how you're going to describe and even plan to use tools, software, and code. So as you're designing your study, you're going to be thinking about how you're going to analyze your data. You know, using open source data, proprietary data. And we're happy to consult with you to talk about particularly open source tools. Sean Purcell, the MPI on NSRR, you know, has created a website called Luna, where there's a lot of open source software to generate some automatic staging and extract microarchitecture features, but there are a lot of other areas too. So again, we would be happy to speak with you about the types of tools and code, and particularly point to open source tools that often help make research more transparent. Next. And then there's the area of access, distribution, and resource. And obviously, this is very much dictated by you, the researcher, in terms of, ensuring that your informed consent is appropriate. You've thought carefully for your study and community and institution privacy and confidentiality protections, and any restrictions. But what we can do with the NSRR is provide sample data sharing language. Recently there was the common rule. That's currently on the NSRR website to really emphasize a new era of data sharing, even seen in the consent form. But we also have created forms to really systematize, in some ways streamline, the collection of data that relate to any restrictions. And in fact, we have, when we ingest new data into NSRR, we have information specifically about these restrictions and so forth. Next. And then there's the oversight of data management, which is really a local, process. And, it's something I think most groups feel they need more resources and more support. And what we are trying to do now, and we've done in the last few webinars and will continue to do, is to really help the community understand best practices for data management, everything from quality control to documentation, how online and open source tools could be used, and over time develop, even data management protocols that might be able to be adapted to many people's needs. Next. Okay, back to you, Paige.
So as Susan mentioned, as we were thinking about the data sharing process, we're really encouraging folks to prepare by thinking about the best practices for data management. And we've tried to capture that in our process for data ingestion. So this starts with a share tab on our website, which details some of the information relevant to what we are asking contributors to provide, as well as what we will provide. And then also capturing some of the information that we have gone over today through our share form, which is a relatively short REDCap survey that gets at some of these key questions and information about your data. We also have curated a submission checklist as kind of a high-level overview of what it is that we will ask for and what we think are desirable items for data submission, the types of things that are important for presenting really well-characterized data to then be shared out with the sleep research community. Our metadata intake form is part of this. We have multiple tabs depending on the type of data that you'll be sharing with us, an overview page so that we can better understand some of the details of your data, something for actigraphy, something for PSG, and really to capture the metadata that we anticipate that you will be sharing with us and sharing publicly. Additionally, we mentioned that we have suggested conventions for signal data. Dr. Purcell has put together a very thorough kind of overview of some best practices when thinking about sharing physiologic signals data. So Susan, would you like to wrap us out?
Yeah, just very quickly. So, what we are, I think what you've heard in the last hour from Chanel, is really the great investment and the careful thinking NIH has done in developing the data management plan and the expectations. And what you heard from Alfonso is really the amazing amount of support of the National Center for Sleep Disorders in really motivating the sleep community to share data. And of course, that's also, I'm personally grateful because of their support of the NSRR. And then what you've heard from Paige and me is really the commitment of our NSRR team to partner with the community to, as I said, try to not only help people meet the minimal needs of the data sharing plan, but really to improve the quality of data that we all collect and save and share. So, as I mentioned, this is a partnership, and there are some things that the data owners are going to be completely, really responsible for, as I described the data types, de-identifying, understanding their own consent, permissions, restrictions, and identifying, what your analysis tools will be. Next slide. But NSRR, on the other hand, can help with that process by providing annotated data management plan forms that, as Paige showed you, we'll have drop-down menus that will be very specific to sleep type data. We've also, as I said, developing a sample course structure and then guidance about all aspects of that relate to this data management plan, from data sharing, metadata intake forms, conventions for improving signals, all aspects, NSRR common data elements, all aspects of trying to really meet those FAIR principles and those NIH guidelines. Next. And so, and just to conclude, as as you think about the types of repositories that may be eligible, this is a little bit of an ad, but I think it's in our community's interest to point this out, is that the NSRR is distinct from other generic repository in that we really are a sleep customized data repository, and we've already spent a number of years developing sleep-related metadata. We have our experience with accommodating, standardizing, and adding value to complex signal data collected overnight. We also see this as an opportunity for NSRR to continue to engage the sleep community in research and sharing of both tools and data. And as I said, I think going forward, we look forward to even a new phase of NSRR that is, in fact, I think, catalyzed by the data management plan, but further puts the data contributors at NSRR together as partners. So I think that's it, but is there one last slide? So yeah, so I think we have time for just a couple of questions if anybody has any.
We can open this to questions for any of the speakers too.
I see Chanel.
Yeah, thank you. Didn't mean to take time from the investigators, but I just really want to commend you as NSR on really thinking proactively and trying to address this beforehand with your community, and is really great. And I'm really excited to see that you're actively trying to chart out a template for the data sharing plan for the sleep community. I think that's just fantastic. I think it's definitely encourage you, once you have a somewhat baked template, reach out to relevant program officers, which you know that will likely review the template, your plan, and to kind of run this by them to get a gut check, so that I'm speaking this from my experience as a DAC chair, since sitting on the DAC, we get a lot of applications for secondary data use research, and a lot of times that we get a large group of a consortium. They want to have coming with a template. They kind of reach out to us first and have us review that and basically discuss if there's anything inappropriate, and so that when the investigators coming with the same template kind of application and with minor variances, the DAC knows that we've seen this, we've discussed this, we've said that it's okay previously, so that it will really expedite your process of getting your plans approved by the program officer.
Thank you so much, Chanel. And I think we got one question I should respond to for clarification, and that's where on the website can one find some of the detailed information on metadata, et cetera. So what I would say is right now, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear, right now the website really focuses on the process for sharing data with us in a very flexible way, because we know that we developed a lot of that before the data management plan, and we wanted to create the bar not to be too high, such that we actually do a lot of the metadata work ourselves, once someone works with us. So the point is, now that everyone is expected to share data, we're putting more effort in sharing our internal processes and what we do think are the best practices for you to include in your data management plan. So over the next couple of months, we'll have more examples from our own experiences that we'll be able to actually share with you for that 2023 plans. Hope I answered the question. Okay, Mike.
Yeah, with that, deep thanks to all of our speakers today. I think this was a really informative webinar, and I think there's a lot of questions that this answered for a lot of people, and we'll do our best to provide any additional resources on the NSRR webinar page related to specific things from our speakers today, and follow up more on any sort of larger things, as Dr. Redline said. So with that, thank you so much. We expect to have more webinars in the future, and we will keep you posted. So thank you so much for attending. We really appreciate it, and we thank all of our speakers.